Hi, I'm Lisa Berry Drago. Welcome to Innate, How Science Invented the Myth of Race. This is Episode 7, Black Pills. In an episode that aired in April 2007, Oprah Winfrey was hosting a Q&A segment with a frequent guest. Most people know him as Dr. Oz. Dr. Oz asked Oprah, "Do you know why African Americans have high blood pressure?" And she responded, "Well, African Americans who survived the slave trade's Middle Passage were those who could hold more salt in their body." And Dr. Oz responded, "That's perfect." Here he is talking about it in an interview.
So those folks who had genes that didn't hold on to salt ended up dying. The survivors came to a new environment and actually benefited them while they were young. But they could maintain salt, because with salt they could maintain water in their bodies, so they could survive those inhumane conditions. But now, fast forward 200 years to a society where you don't have those headaches anymore. Now all you've got is a genetic limitation that leads to high blood pressure.
The theory they're discussing goes like this. Enslaved Africans whose bodies could hold more salt were better able to survive thirst and deprivation during the transatlantic voyage. And once that group had children, their genes, which favored holding more salt, were passed down to the next generation. This genetic superpower for holding on to salt may have served them well when trying to survive dehydration in the belly of a 17th century slave ship, but now it's leading their descendants to struggle with high blood pressure. And that theory, propagated here by Dr. Oz, a former heart surgeon and failed Senate candidate, is known as the slavery hypertension hypothesis. It was shared during the height of Oprah's primetime show, which commanded an audience of 8 million viewers a day. And you can see why Oprah might find this theory compelling. It ties a problem afflicting the African American community to a shared history. It roots a modern struggle within a historical one. The only problem is, there's no data to support it.
So the slavery hypertension hypothesis is sort of a just so story.
This is Jay Kaufman, a professor of epidemiology at the University of Montreal, who's written about the hypothesis.
I'm referring to these books for children that were written by Kipling around the turn of the century. And they're stories about how animals came to take on their shape, like the elephant got his long trunk because an alligator pulled on it and stretched it out and became very long. Like, these are stories that describe in some kind of a mythical way the way that nature came to take its current shape. And the slavery hypertension hypothesis is sort of like that.
The slavery hypertension theory emerged after a survey in the 1960s found that African Americans in the United States have nearly twice the rate of high blood pressure than white Americans. And despite a lack of evidence, this theory has endured for decades.
But the remarkable thing about it over historical time is just how pervasive and resilient this conjecture was, because it ended up appearing in all kinds of textbooks, and it ended up being discussed at all kinds of scientific meetings, and many people describe it as though it's a respected scientific hypothesis, and yet nobody's ever actually observed any data that would suggest any mechanism of some kind of genetic evolution that would give Black people higher blood pressure than white people. There's no data that would suggest any reality for this story.
The biggest issue with this hypothesis is not just that it's wrong, but that it sends the message that the problem of hypertension is a problem created within the Black body. Framing the story this way kind of absolves society from addressing all the other systemic problems that we know can cause hypertension. Not having access to healthy foods, not having safe places to exercise, outdoor spaces, and of course, stress from all the structural racism. Blaming genetics for social problems is something Jay Kaufman calls genetic determinism.
If I say, I have a gene for criminality or a gene for high blood pressure, it's not anybody's fault. It's just an accident in nature. It's my fate, essentially. It's beyond my control. So this operates, this kind of genetic determinism operates to absolve everybody, individual behavior, societal behavior. In fact, it's mythological.
So, just to summarize, the slavery hypertension hypothesis is a way of framing the problem of hypertension as a problem within the Black body. But medicine has also tried to frame the solution the same way. In the early 2000s, a pharmaceutical company applied this logic when it sold a pill to treat hypertension only in African Americans. This so-called miracle drug was named BiDil.
Today, researchers announced that BiDil worked spectacularly in African Americans.
We saw a 43% improvement in survival, a 33% decrease in hospitalization rate, and a significant improvement in quality of life.
The drug's maker, Nitromed, does not claim that BiDil can't work in white or in Asian heart patients, only that it does work in blacks who suffer far more heart disease than whites.
In some ways, this sounds like a good thing, right? Well, as the old cliche goes, the devil's in the details.
They are opening a Pandora's box by using race as a means to get FDA approval for this drug.
That was Jonathan Cahn, the author of Race in a Bottle, speaking in 2004. He documented the BiDil saga from the very beginning.
You open up the road to people talking about races as being genetically, biologically different, which opens up a whole host of possible avenues for discrimination, for mistreatment.
In a nutshell, that's the story we're going to tell today, the story of BiDil. How it became the first race-specific drug approved in the United States, and how the medical system helped perpetuate, without evidence, this myth that race is a biological construct.
It's a story of people who I think are very well-meaning in many respects in trying to address concerns about health and health disparities, but haven't appreciated the potential dangers of using race in biomedical contexts without appropriate thought being given to what a volatile category it is when you mix up race and genetics.
Chapter 1. Dead in the Water.
In July of 1956, Jay Cohn was an internist at the Beth Israel Hospital in Boston when a man named Sam Farber was admitted into the emergency room with a heart attack. He was given oxygen and morphine for it.
And I followed him during the weeks that he was in the hospital recovering from the heart attack and sent him home apparently well and ready to be returned to activity slowly. And 6 months later, he came back to the hospital, now in severe heart failure.
In those days, there was little information as to why a heart attack could lead to a disease called heart failure. A heart attack is when blood flow is partially or completely interrupted from the heart. And heart failure is a disease in which the heart cannot effectively pump blood to the rest of the body. They're two different conditions, but they're interrelated. We now know a heart attack damages and weakens the muscle, and therefore a patient could develop heart failure. And the prognosis is bleak. 50% of people die within 5 years of diagnosis. But at the time, in 1956, no one knew that. And so Sam died on his second visit to the ER.
And no one could explain to me why he had developed heart failure because he didn't have any new damage to his heart.
This death sent Jay Cohn on the path to figure out how hypertension, or high blood pressure, heart attacks, and heart failure are all connected. He needed to figure out a way to treat them. By 1972, Cohn was a cardiologist at the University of Minnesota. And at this time, there are still few ways to treat heart failure. One was a plant-based medicine called digitalis. Another was through diuretics, which just make it easier for the heart to pump blood. Cohn remembered reading that there was a chemical that could lower severe high blood pressure. He got some of it in powder form to use for testing. It wasn't approved for medical use, but his university had permission to use it for investigations, so he began running tests on animals.
As soon as you started dripping the infusion into a vein, the blood pressure would come down. So it was a remarkable way to treat high blood pressure. No one had ever used it to treat heart failure, so that was a whole new approach.
Two problems here. One, again, this chemical is not approved for medical use to treat heart failure. Two, it's got to be applied through a needle. Cohn wanted to have the same effect of the drug, but in pill form. And he figured out that he could almost replicate it by using two generic pills already on the market. One was hydralazine, the other was isosorbide dinitrate. They're both known as vasodilators. And this combination later became known as BiDil, even though it didn't get its official name until 1992, for the purposes of this episode, we're going to keep referring to this pill combination as BiDil. Together, these two drugs help the body make nitric oxide, which is a gas that widens the arteries and lets blood flow more smoothly with less of a strain on the heart. Imagine a water pump pumping into small pipes. To get water through all the pipes, it's probably easier to make the pipes bigger as opposed to making the pump work harder. Then the water isn't forced out at higher and higher pressure.
No longer did we focus on making the heart beat more strongly, but we focused on relaxing the arteries so the heart, with its reduced pumping ability, could empty into the arteries at a lower resistance and a lower impedance.
In 1979, Cohn went to his old employer, the Veterans Administration. He got some funding to develop a test of theory trial for his BiDil combination drug. The first trial had 643 patients, black and white veterans. It lasted for 5 years. And it basically showed that BiDil worked to prevent heart failure. You'll hear us refer to this trial as VHEFT-1. Now, this trial was promising enough to get him funding for a second trial. And the second trial pitted BiDil against another drug, which is known as an ACE inhibitor. These types of drugs basically suppress the part of your body that regulates blood pressure, and this trial was known as VHEFT-2. Now, something remarkable happened during this trial. Remember we said there's very few things to treat heart failure? Well, the ACE inhibitors worked so well in this trial that this type of drug now became the go-to medication for treating heart failure, a new gold standard.
The outcome of that trial was that it did not appear that the BiDil drugs did any better than the ACE inhibitor.
So this could have been the end of the story. The ACE inhibitor was a better drug. BiDil was just a medical curiosity. But J. Cohn didn't give up. He wanted to do one more trial. However, by this point in the late 80s, the federal money had dried up. Undeterred, Cohn tried to get a patent. Now, the odds weren't in his favor here. You usually can't get a patent for 2 generic drugs that are already on the market. But he got the patent office to agree based on one significant difference: delivery. Because instead of taking 2 generics, BiDil was administered in a single pill.
There was no mention of race in this original patent. So at this point, in 1989, BiDil is conceived of as a drug for everybody. And indeed, a lot of articles were published out of the VHEF studies during the 1980s. Not one of them mentioned race. It was all just about, this drug seems to have a very positive impact on heart failure mortality and quality of life.
With the patent now in hand, Cohn partners up with a company called Medco. It's located in the Research Triangle in North Carolina. Medco takes the data from the original trial with the 643 veterans and made preparations to get FDA approval. A patent lasts for 20 years, and it gives 20 years of exclusivity, meaning only the company that holds the patent can make and sell it. And FDA approval is mandatory if the drug is going to be sold and marketed in the US. Now, FDA approval can take years, and Medco and Cohn finally presented their application in 1996. The FDA review panels are usually 10 to 12 experts reviewing the data, and they make recommendations to the FDA for approval. This panel was mostly cardiologists and 2 biostatisticians. Things didn't go according to plan. In 1997, the FDA rejected their application.
What the FDA said was very instructive. It said, "We think this drug is approvable, but the statistical data you have supplied us is insufficiently well controlled to merit approval." That's because the original studies were conceived of as test of theory trials, not as new drug trials, so they didn't have the appropriate controls in place. And the cardiologists were saying, does this drug work? Well, I would give this drug to my patients, right? But the biostatisticians were saying that may be the case, but the statistics are a hash, right? The statistics are a mess. The data's not good enough. And so at one point they poll the panel and ask them whether or not they think BiDil works. And essentially what the clinicians are saying, that this is almost a direct quote, they say, "Do I think it works? Clinically, yes. Statistically, no." Right? Which is a fantastic or fascinating kind of concept. So they say, well, if you conduct one well-controlled follow-up trial, Medco, right, clinical trial, that is controlled like a new drug trial, we think it's likely approvable.
Medco's stock plummeted 20% after the rejection, and they pulled out of the BiDil business for two reasons. One, clinical trials are the most expensive part of the process, especially for a relatively small drug company like Medco. The VHAFT-1 and VHAFT-2 trials were done with taxpayer money, so they thought they could have gotten the drug approved on the cheap. Reason number two, by this point, the patent that J. Cohn received is already 10 years old, which means they only have 10 years left of potential profits. And on top of that, finally getting FDA approval could take a few more years, meaning that their patent life is shrinking.
And so it's at that point then in 1997 that BiDil seems dead in the water. And so what happens at that point is now, for the first time, race enters the story.
J. Cohn needed to save his drug, so he went back to the VHAFT-1 and VHAFT-2 trials. He basically chopped the data up into subgroups and then divided them along racial lines. He isolated a sample of Black patients, which was 49 people.
You dutifully go through the process of looking at all the subgroups in your trial in order to see if there's any difference, and the answer always is there's no difference. So we were blown away when we did the first analysis of the difference in the racial response.
What he found is that BiDil seemed to work really well in prolonging the survival of Black patients.
And that was a revelation that opened the door to questioning whether racial distinction would help us in managing patients with heart failure.
Cohn applied for and received another patent in 2000.
And the new patent ends up looking almost exactly like the old patent, except it says a method of treating heart failure in a Black patient. And the patent office grants the patent. And this is a critical turning point in BiDil's shift to becoming a racialized drug. Because you have the federal government giving the imprimatur to using race as, in effect, a genetic category here. And what's quite striking about the federal government's approval here, the U.S. Patent Office approval, is that it seems to go against, very directly, a doctrine known as double patenting.
Just to explain the double patenting problem, if you get a patent for using BiDil to treat heart failure in human beings writ large, which Cohn originally got in 1989, you can't then get a second patent for using the drugs to treat heart failure in a subset of human beings. In this case, just African Americans.
But in America, my reading of this is the power and salience of the idea of race is such here that it was the idea that, oh no, this really is something different. And the only way it could be conceived of as something different to warrant the issuing of a new patent would be if you conceived of Black people as somehow different from people or approval. And this is the deep concern over the unintended messages being sent here. But powerfully, what you have here then is the shift really towards getting this racial patent had less to do with the science and medicine underlying the mechanisms of BiDil's efficacy, and much more to do with the fact that they were turned down by the original FDA panel. The original company didn't want to conduct a follow-up trial.
By this point, Cohn now has a new pharmaceutical partner in a company called Nitromed, based in Boston. He licenses the patent to them. Nitromed likes this new patent because the old one, issued in 1989, is more than halfway through its life cycle, which means that with a new patent, issued in 2000, there's 20 more years of exclusivity.
No drug company spends the money in doing a clinical trial unless there is a product at the end of the line that they can market. And if you don't have patent protection, you can't market the product because anyone else can make it. So of course that's true. The incentive in the pharmaceutical industry for drug development is obviously financial. So that's the way the pharmaceutical industry works. I don't know why Jonathan Cahn doesn't understand that, but he implied that he thought that was that was a strange thing for a drug company to do. Of course not. That's what all drug companies do.
Chapter 2. A Blunt Tool.
With the patent in hand, Nitromed went to the FDA to get the drug approved. They still needed to go through the drug approval gold standard, 2 large, well-controlled clinical trials. Now, the FDA did something surprising here. It said that Nitromed could use the data from the previous 2 trials, VHEFT1 and VHEFT2, and they'd be the equivalent of 1 large, well-controlled trial. It asked them to only do 1 additional trial, and just on 1 population, self-identified African Americans. These 2 together would satisfy their equivalent of the gold standard. It was incredibly unusual. Up to that point, it had never happened before.
And that's because the logic was, oh, well, in the initial trials, it seemed to show such great efficacy in African Americans. And the irony of that is this claim was based primarily on the study from VHEFT1. But in that trial, the claim of enhanced efficacy or effectiveness, I should say, in the Black subjects was based on an enrolled population of 49 African Americans who were actually on the BiDil drugs, right? Tiny, tiny amount. Usually a clinical trial enrolls in the thousands, like, 3,000 to 6,000, say, would be a typical clinical trial. This was 49 African Americans.
Incredibly, the drug approval process was allowed to go forward thanks to just 49 people.
They kept calling it a signal. I would argue it's a fairly weak signal to rest an entire drug approval process on, but this is testament sort of to the power of race.
So Nitromed started working on its second trial of just African Americans in 2001. It was led by the Association of Black Cardiologists. The trial had 1,036 self-identified African American participants enrolled. This trial, using self-identified African American participants, was called AHEFT. Now, keep in mind those words, self-identified African American, because a lot of what's going to come hinges on that. But anyway, 1,000 people is still a very small number compared to other trials, which was good for Nitromed because a smaller trial means a cheaper trial.
But the logic there was, well, this is an enriched population. It was the idea, it was sort of like this pseudo-pharmacogenomic idea that if you have a targeted population that a drug is likely to do well in, you can enroll smaller numbers to get the effects you want.
The enriched population in this case were the self-identified African Americans. And here we're going to point something out. This trial uses race as a proxy for genetics. The implication here is that there's some unknown biological mechanism at work for high blood pressure in African Americans writ large. The assumption here is that they're all genetically the same. But in fact, there can be far more genetic diversity among people within each race than between races. What's also strange about using self-identified African American is that this is a socially constructed term.
They didn't want to get into sort of the politics of race, but they were very happy to get into what they saw as, or were purporting to observe as, the sort of biology of race. Right? So, well, we don't want to get into all these other issues, these sort of purportedly political concerns about whether race is genetic. We just want to look at the data that we've gathered. But the data they're gathering is based on all sorts of prior assumptions about the sort of biological or genetic nature of socially constructed racial categories. They're enrolling self-identified African Americans. Self-identification is a social process, and the concept of African American is itself, racial concepts themselves are socially conditioned.
Keith Ferdinand is a cardiologist at the Tulane School of Medicine in New Orleans and a member of the Association of Black Cardiologists. He was one of the principal investigators on the African American trial, with 2 sites, one in the 9th Ward and another at Xavier University School of Pharmacy in Uptown New Orleans. He and his colleague Charles Curry, the chief cardiologist at Howard University and the founder of the Association for Black Cardiologists, were concerned about this very issue, enrolling self-identified African Americans.
Dr. Curry was very reluctant to give the stamp of imprimatur of the Association of Black Cardiologists for this study, because he was prescient in that he felt that there may be of feeling that we were endorsing a Black drug. And we really didn't see that that would happen because we say, well, there's a signal in VHF, and our patients have more cardiovascular death and hospitalization. So if it helps, let's study and see if it helps. That was our path. His path was, yeah, but you don't want to be locked into this idea that you're making scientific discoveries on a drug that would just work in Black patients.
Nevertheless, Ferdinand went ahead with the trial for a few reasons. One, this practice is common in medicine.
So if you look in medicine in general, we use the terms white, Black, Hispanic. These are social terms. They're really divorced from any true biologic or genetic markers. To a large extent, it's a very blunt tool. You can make the point that it's an inaccurate tool. And we recognize it as a marker for a whole host of things outside of just skin color and language. But it's kind of a shorthand that's used in clinical trials.
Reason number 2, the AHAF trial was groundbreaking. The vast majority of medical trials in the United States are in white men. Just 5% of clinical trial participants are typically African Americans. AHAF had the largest number of Black women in a clinical trial at that time.
So we use on a regular basis drugs which underrepresent the Black population. Here, the script was flipped somewhat. We wanted to see a drug that may be beneficial in the Black population.
The third reason is pragmatic. It's not like he went into this trial thinking BiDil was a miracle drug. In some ways, he just wanted to give his patients good medical treatment. And if this study gave him the resources to do it, he was going to take the opportunity.
In our communities, we saw the heart failure hospitalization. We saw the early death. I treated these patients. I've had patients die in my arms. I've done CPR on 2 patients at once in the United States. So I have seen what happens when persons are in the throes of heart failure and can't survive. So we said, well, I understand that there's some reluctance, but let's just do the study, and it gives the chance for our patients. They get free medications, they get free testing, echocardiograms, which at that time were quite expensive, hundreds of dollars. Whether or not they had insurance, it didn't make a difference.
It's helpful to understand a bit of background here. In 2002, the Institute of Medicine, a federal agency, had just published a paper called Unequal Treatment: Confronting Racial and Ethnic Disparities in Healthcare. It was an explosive paper that showed African Americans have higher rates of cardiovascular disease, stroke, heart failure, hypertension, among others, all at higher rates than white people. And essentially, the source of those differences is structural racism, both within medicine and outside it. So there's a sense of urgency in doctors like Ferdinand who are concerned with health equity, who want to do something about it.
I wanted to do something with my education that would benefit my people. And I knew at that time that Black people had poor health care, so I wanted to become a provider. And as the data started to accumulate even more, that there were these cardiovascular disparities driven by hypertension, heart failure, chronic kidney disease, et cetera, I focused on cardiovascular medicine. So it wasn't some sort of romantic love of medicine. It was a cold-blooded decision what I could do to help my people.
Ferdinand's intent was to provide relief and care to his patients. His intent was not to send a message that Black people are biologically different.
We want to do something to help our patients. We see a signal. We want to study a drug, see if it helps our patients. And if it does, then it's something that we want to add to our armamentarium of medications. It doesn't mean that somehow simplistically we would say, Eureka, we found a drug that only helps people who self-identify as Black. Oh, you're not? You can't use our drug. That's illogical to me. And we never had that as our intent.
Rana Hogarth, the author of Medicalizing Blackness, says that Ferdinand's buy-in for BiDil shows the problem is not the drug itself, but rather the system that created it.
The point of health disparities and why BiDil is so thorny is that he recognized, as anyone would, that there are health disparities, and he is doing what he needs to do for his community. So not only are his intentions good, his outcomes are good, but the problem is he's trapped in a system where this is how he's got to do it. Like, so if you want to say, I'm going to make sure they get the best care oh yeah, and the BiDil thing, that's incidental, but you have to still be a part of it. Yeah. That's the issue. It shouldn't have to be that way. His patients should not be suffering in this way. And so the point is that the story of the African-American cardiologists who are supporting BiDil, who participate in AHEFT, is a testament to how much or how bad health disparities are and what lengths that Black physicians are going to go to look after their community, to say, okay, nobody else is going to do it. Here's an opportunity that landed in our laps. We can say, no, on paper, theoretically, this is reifying the idea of race as a biological thing. Yeah, that's fine and good, but if you, as he says, he sees this every day. So he can say, all right, that's not great. I'm going to make that the lesser priority, and I'm going to say, what can I do for my patients today? If I sign on to this, how many people are going to have a better existence? And I think that that's perfectly valid. That doesn't mean that he is, somehow was tricked.
The story of BiDil is less about the drug itself and what impact it might have had on patients, and more about how people used BiDil to achieve their goals.
But I also think that there is a way that you can acknowledge both, that you can say, look, this is the system that we have, and I have to work within the system. Just like for Jay Cohn, this is how I'm going to get approval. All right, I'm going to work in this system. The reality is that this is a story of people working within a system where race is given this meaning that it really ought to not have. And this is the mischief that falls out.
Ferdinand expressed resentment at the fact that people have implied that he was bought to endorse a Black drug.
I will tell you, as an investigator with 2 sites, member of the steering committee and the leader of the Association of Black Cardiologists, we never intended to make a Black drug. And that's a simplistic and somewhat a chauvinistic way to describe the efforts of people who spent a lot of effort to become a physician and then a cardiologist and then specialize in clinical trials, which many of us were, some of the leading docs at the time, that we are simplistic enough in our thinking to think that we were making a Black drug. That just doesn't make sense to me, but I know some feel very comfortable casting aspersions on our efforts and articulate that. And if you really think on its own face, it doesn't really make sense, but it doesn't make sense that people with this degree of education and commitment, lifelong commitment, are going to somehow think that there is a drug that should only be used in persons who self-identify as Black.
A crucial question remains. Why didn't Nitromed include a more diverse group of people in its trial to see if BiDil worked in, say, white Americans or Asian Americans? And the answer is, they had a financial disincentive for finding out that BiDil worked regardless of race because their patent only applied to the drug as administered to African American patients.
It satisfied Nitromed, but it obviously didn't satisfy the critics who thought that we were trying to make money off of Black people, or some ridiculous claim like that, as if treating Black people is not a benefit to society. Of course it is.
The trial actually had fantastic results. In fact, the results were so good that those who were taking a placebo were given the drug instead, and the trial stopped ahead of schedule. The results made national news.
And in a study released today, we learned that the drug worked particularly well on African Americans. Combined with routine therapy for heart failure, it dramatically reduced the risk of dying.
It could be a turning point not only in treating heart failure, but for the overall approach to developing medications. Doctors report success today in saving lives with a heart drug tested on a specific group of people, African Americans.
The fact that the drug worked wasn't really a surprise.
And indeed, it showed good results, as everybody expected, because the VHEF trial showed good results. There's no reason it shouldn't have shown good results.
But if the drug had been tested in people of other races, would it have shown similarly good results, regardless of race? Some of the AHEFT trial investigators themselves said that was the case. But we'll never know, because it was only tested in self-identified African Americans. For Jay Cohn, the good results were welcome news.
It was a dramatic moment. It was a vindication for everything we had done over the years and for our recognition that there was potential difference. We didn't study the difference between Blacks and whites, but here we had data, at least, that we knew this population had a dramatic benefit. And it was very reassuring and exhilarating because it was a drug that we had invented, and here it was helping keep people alive, and the potential for its use in the Black population was so dramatic that we felt we had solved a major healthcare problem.
With the AHAF trial completed and successful, BiDil was now headed to the FDA for approval.
Approval for BiDil as a heart treatment for African Americans is now up to the FDA, but is expected by early next year.
Cohen was cautiously optimistic that BiDil would get its approval.
And we were suspicious of whether the FDA would follow through and approve the drug for one racial group. I mean, that was a precedent never visited before by the FDA to approve a drug for a racial subgroup.
Chapter 3. Drugs aren't racist. People are.
Part of the process for FDA approval involves a hearing with a panel of experts. The panel gives a recommendation, and the FDA basically rubber stamps it. This is a key part of the process, and BiDil's hearing was on June 16, 2005. One of the first people to speak in favor of the drug was Dana Christensen, a physician, a member of Congress, and a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. She said that BiDil should be approved as a kind of restorative justice for African Americans, for whom, quote, treatment has been denied and deferred for 400 years, unquote. The support is understandable, but the drug was going to have an unintended consequence. That is, labeling Black people as biologically different.
I think what it was, though, was also a failure to appreciate sort of short-term versus long-term goals. Because the short-term goal might be, here's a drug for Black people. The long-term goal might be sort of contributing to a narrative that says health disparities, which are a much bigger problem than just heart failure, that health disparities are something that should be fixed with pills rather than with equity and social policy and justice. I don't think that the people supporting it were hypocrites or simply greedy or anything of that sort. I think they simply did not take the care necessary to really think through the implications of what their support involved.
Jonathan Cahn also gave testimony the day of the hearing. And his testimony gets to the crux of the debate at the FDA. They weren't trying to decide if the drug should be available at all, but rather whether it should be labeled as a pill only for Black patients.
But the main thing I was saying, and that a number of people were saying, is yes, the indications are this is a good drug. There's no reason not to approve it, but there is no reason to approve it with a race-specific indication. And even, people from the International Society for Hypertension in Blacks and things of that sort would say, oh yes, we love this drug, it's great, but there's no need for a race-specific approval.
One committee member, Vivian Oda Wong, who was part of Howard University's National Human Genome Center, she had one of the same concerns we discussed earlier, the fact that the AHAF trial used self-identified African American as equivalent to a biological marker of difference. Here's Oda Wong appearing on PBS NewsHour a day after the hearing.
I was not convinced by the scientific evidence that actually it was effective for this broad range of a very variable group called African American. This brings up the whole issue of, is race biological? And I am from the persuasion that it is, at this point, not biological, that in fact the self-identification of racial identity is a complex sort of process that includes social, cultural, and psychological issues, and that it really serves as a biological proxy in this particular study.
In short, using social categories as a proxy for genetics is basically sloppy science. Jonathan Cahn says it's also a symptom of arrogance.
When if you look at your typical biomedical study article published in Nature or Science or the New England Journal or something like that, and especially if it involves genetics, the methods section is very detailed, going into sort of what sequencing platform they used and what software they used and what primers they used and all this and that. And then when it comes to race, they simply say self-identified race. And the idea is that, that captures all they need to know about race. And they don't think anything more about how race is this fraught and complex category and what it means. So I often tell, when I'm speaking to people, to doctors or geneticists, I say, genetics is really complex, but so is race. right? In everyday life, walking down the street, we may say, oh yeah, I know who's black, who's white, who's Asian, who's Hispanic, whatever, in sort of like a kind of sloppy social way. Like we all live with race every day. So since we all live with race every day, we may think it's obvious. And maybe for everyday interactions it by and large is. But in the world of biomedicine, it's anything but obvious. It's much more complicated and much more fraught because you are trying to connect race with what's going on inside the body.
The FDA committee chairperson, Steve Nissen, didn't see it this way. He said that he wished they did know how exactly the drug worked inside the bodies of African Americans, but since they didn't know, the best they had were the VHAFT and AHAFT trials. Wong countered that the standard of research, those large, well-controlled studies that they usually required, had been lowered when it came to African Americans. What kind of message was that sending? At the heart of their debate was, how exactly does this drug work anyway? Nitromed was using the self-identification as a proxy for an unknown biological marker. And while it's true that the AHAFT trial showed BiDil as successful in treating black patients, it didn't give enough evidence to the FDA to approve it as a race-based medicine. Neither Cohn nor Nitromed could explain how or why the drug worked biologically, specifically on black people. What was this strange mechanism at work?
Race, of course, is not a biological phenomenon. It is a social phenomenon, according to the social scientists. And that doesn't really matter, and it's never mattered to the FDA. The FDA just wants, show me the population and show me it works. And we show you the population. We don't understand why it works. You don't have to document that. You just have to show that this therapy, when applied to this population, produces a beneficial effect.
You may be surprised to learn, as I was surprised to learn, that it turns out you don't have to prove how something works. You just have to prove that it works.
Well, of course, we all wanted to know that, but the FDA only bases their approval process not on mechanism of action, but on data. And they were happy. All they needed was evidence that survival was improved and it was statistically sound analysis, and the drug gets approved. There is no requirement to identify a mechanism by which the drug works.
There are multiple medications that are available without doctors understanding the scientific reason why they work. Think of it as cause and effect. While knowing the cause would be nice, the effect is the most important.
As physicians, we do the best we can with science, but there's a certain degree of art. So you look at studies, you see where patients in clinical trials may have benefit, but we may not really even understand the science of why exactly one group benefited versus another. That takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. But in medicine, we're simple human beings with simple tools, and we tend to do the best we can for our patients. We often are doing it more as an artist than a true scientist.
In any case, Nissen dismissed the concern that by approving BiDil, they were sending the unintended message that black people were biologically different. He said, quote, "Drugs aren't racists, people are," unquote. The expert panel approved BiDil.
And now today, for the first time, an FDA panel of experts has recommended approval for a drug for one race.
BiDil became the first race-specific drug on the American market.
And the logic they gave, the rationale, I should say, they gave was, well, the drug was only tested in black people. So that's the population for which we have to approve it.
There's a weird logic at work here. Most drugs on the market today are primarily tested on white people. And this is because of a lack of diversity in clinical trials. This has long been a problem in medicine. And yet those drugs are approved for everyone. So why is it that when a drug is tested only on black people, it's only approved for black patients?
But when the FDA was reviewing data from clinical trials conducted in white populations, they just saw human beings, right? The idea being that the category white was not raced. It was just that white equaled human. And so if it works in white people, it works in everybody. The category white being coextensive with the category human. It's only with BiDil where for the first time you get somebody saying, okay, the category, it was only tested in black people. That is a biologically salient category that is not coextensive with the category human, so therefore it should only be approved in black people. So the message, unintended, but nonetheless the message being sent is, tested in white people, it's good enough for everybody because the category white is coextensive with the category human. You approve it in black people, you test it in black people, you can only approve it in black people because black people are somehow less fully representative of humanity.
Our producer, Rigo Hernandez, asked Jay Cohn about this logic.
So then if a drug that is only tested in African Americans, then by that logic, shouldn't it also be prescribed to everyone? Or if a drug is tested only on white people, then shouldn't it only be prescribed on white people? Like, how do you reconcile that logic?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I agree with you completely. It's inconsistent, and that's what we wondered when the FDA reviewed the AHEF results. That was the one question that Nitromed had. Are they really going to follow through and approve the drug for one racial group, or are they going to turn around and say, well, the drug is effective, let's approve it for everybody? But they stuck to their promotional idea that black people, if you study black people, it's good for black people. If you study white people, it's good for everybody. It's obviously a fallacious reasoning, but we do a lot of strange things based upon the reality of them.
Fallacious reasoning or not, BiDil was approved. Now it would succeed or fail in the market.
Chapter 4. Suspicion.
Now that BiDil had FDA approval, Nitromed could market it as a drug to treat heart failure in African Americans. And with the patent at hand, it could do so exclusively for 20 years. One financial analysis projected that the opportunity could be worth up to $1 billion. But they could stand to make more if they prescribed it not just to African Americans, but to everyone.
Of course, the reason Nitromed wanted the race-specific approval is because they needed the race-specific approval from the FDA in order to protect their race-specific patent. So what FDA approval says is, this drug is approved for use to treat heart failure in a black patient. What that means is that that drug can only be marketed to treat heart failure in a black patient. Doesn't mean it can't be prescribed. It can be prescribed. Doctors can prescribe it however they want.
This is a kind of win-win for Nitromed because while they can only market it to one group, doctors can prescribe it to everyone, meaning your market for the drug is not just limited to one group of people. Our producer, Rigo Hernandez, asked Jay Cohn about it.
It's been described as like having your cake and eat it too.
Well, that's probably true, I think. But the distinction was never made because we thought there was a fundamental difference in response. The distinction was made just so that we could do a study of modest size and get a benefit so that we could get approval. And I think that's misunderstood a little bit. There's nothing wrong with that. That, in fact, is the only way you do clinical trials. You have to find a population that is responsive to your drug so you can accomplish a positive trial.
With patent exclusivity, FDA approval, and the endorsement of black organizations, BiDil seemed destined to succeed. Except, it failed. One factor was cost. Prior to FDA approval, Nitromed was saying that BiDil was going to be priced around $2.50 a day. But shortly after the approval, their analysis came back and said it was actually going to cost around $12 a day.
Nitromed double-crossed us and raised the price of the drug, so it had an adverse effect on their sales, I think.
Nitromed justified the cost increase by saying it was going to save American healthcare a lot of money by preventing hospitalizations.
Nitromed simply got greedy and priced itself out of the market. But Nitromed thought that the drug would essentially sell itself because it had gotten so much big media coverage as the first black drug.
There are multiple explanations for why BiDil failed. Hospitals and insurance companies didn't want to pay for it because it was expensive, and the two generics that make up BiDil are already widely available. Some doctors also didn't want to add yet another pill to the many drugs their heart failure patients were already taking. But perhaps the most compelling reason is best illustrated by a TV show on Fox called House MD. In an episode from 2006, a black doctor was seeing a black patient with hypertension.
There's something new that should help you out. Combines a nitrate with a blood pressure pill. It's targeted to African Americans.
Targeted? I've had white people lying to me for 60 years.
Later in the episode, Dr. House, who is white, sees the same patient. The patient again refuses to take a drug that's only for black patients. He's skeptical, distrustful.
I'm not buying into no racist drug, okay?
It's racist because it helps black people more than white people? Well, on behalf of my peeps, let me just say thanks for dying on principle for us.
Look, my heart's red, your heart's red. And it don't make no sense to give us different drugs.
To resolve the crisis, Dr. House writes another script for the same drug without the patient knowing.
Fine. I'll give you the same medicine we give Republicans.
The episode treats his fears as paranoid, but if you've listened this far into our season, you know it's an earned mistrust.
And this was brought home to me when I was giving a talk at a law school about BiDil around this time. And a black woman in the audience, a law professor, was saying, so you're telling me that if I go to my doctor, she'll tell me, oh, we've got this drug that's just for you, just for black people. And I say, yeah. I said, well, I'll tell you, if my doctor told me that, I'd say, please give me the same drug you give the white folks. Thanks very much. But again, there's a lesson there about, the suspicion, the well-earned suspicion in communities of color about exploitation at the hands of biomedical establishments. So that may have played into it somewhat.
The BiDil patent expired in 2020. Nitromed went out of business. Ferdinand still prescribes BiDil to his patients if they don't respond well to other treatments. As for Jay Cohn, he's retired and living in Florida. Last year, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American College of Cardiology. He says he has no interest in doing any more trials or studies around race.
So I've learned my lesson not to stay away from race. It's the third rail of biological studies. It's too inflammatory a topic.
Creating a drug just for black patients doesn't eradicate structural racism. It helps further shape it. It shifts responsibility to the individual and takes it off society at large.
So the great appeal of something like BiDil is like, oh, we've got this messy problem of racism that everybody's very uncomfortable dealing with or talking about. So how do we fix racism? Do we fix it with a pill, or do we fix it with sort of like very fraught and contested racial politics, right? Well, the appeal of a pill is very powerful under those circumstances. It lets you have this sort of conflict-free, technologically managed way to sort of address racism that lets you off the hook for dealing with any sort of more complex or messier social issues.
An individual solution allows us to ignore the real problem, and that has real consequences.
When you say there's biological difference, it's never just that there's difference. There's always a hierarchical aspect involved. And that's where I say, blacks being somehow less human than whites, in a sense, less representative. Bad things happen when race and genetics get mixed in a sort of essentializing way.
This episode was reported and produced by Rigoberto Hernandez, with additional production by Mariel Carr. It was edited by Padmini Raghunath and mixed by Jonathan Pfeffer, who also composed our innate theme music. Distillations is more than a podcast. It's also a multimedia magazine. You can find our videos, stories, and podcasts at distillations.org. You can follow the Science History Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for news about our podcasts and everything else going on in our museum, library, and research center. The Science History Institute remains committed to revealing the role of science in our world. Please support our efforts at sciencehistory.org/give now. For Distillations, I'm Lisa Berry Drago.